I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. My guest this week is Richard Davies.
Consumers look at our offering in totality. They don't sit there and slice and dice it like we do. They don't pull apart packaging. They don't look at the advertising in isolation. They look at the totality of the brand, that we have to have a really tight proposition. The second equally important part, we then have to go through and we have to assess each of the elements of that brand against that brand proposition.
Richard Davies is a seasoned consumer goods industry veteran with a remarkable career spanning nearly 3 decades, contributing to over 250 brands across more than 50 categories. He has an extensive background in brand strategy and consumer insights, holding various executive roles at Unilever. As Chief Marketing Officer at Newell Brands, Richard led the company's marketing and development functions, overseeing the creation of over 4,000 new product innovations. Since co-founding Alchemy-Rx, Richard has specialized in marketing, focusing on founder-led brands, private equity, and public companies. He is an expert in brand strategy, brand building, brand innovation, and consumer insights. My interview with Richard Davies is coming right up. But first...
My dad works in B2B marketing, but I never really knew what that meant. Then one day my dad came by my school for career day and told everyone in my class he was a big ROAS man. Then he just kept saying things like, the bigger the ROAS, the better, over and over. My friends still laugh at me to this day. I think it means calculating a return on ad spend. One thing's for sure, I'll be known as the ROAS man's kid for the rest of my days. Why couldn't you just be a fireman or a lawyer? Why? You ruined my life, Dad.
Not everyone gets B2B, but LinkedIn has the people who do. And with ads on LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people based on job title, industry, likelihood to buy, and more. Start converting your B2B audience into high-quality leads today. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/MPN to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/MPN. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Danielle Wiley hosts a great podcast called The Art of Sway. Danielle, tell us what you talk about on the show.
The Art of Sway brings listeners inside the world of marketing as seen through the lens of influence. So each week I chat with an expert guest for a lively discussion about connecting ideas with audiences in an attempt to uncover all the ways influence impacts how and what we discover, purchase, and recommend to each other.
Wow. And where can people subscribe?
Go to theartofswaypodcast.com, find the show at marketingpodcasts.net, or search for The Art of Sway wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe.
Richard Davies, welcome to On Brand.
Thanks, Nick. Good to be here.
I am eager to chat about your work, your career in consumer insights at a time when consumer insights and how we build a brand strategy around them has changed dramatically. What would you say is the biggest wave that you have been riding or following in shifts in consumer insights today?
So that's a great question. And just to sort of clarify, so I'm not a market researcher. I'm a marketeer. I managed to spend 5 years leading a research and insight, a consumer insight department at Unilever, which kind of gave me a sort of a unique position of being able to understand what it is that marketers want and need from their counterparts in insight. I think to answer your question, I think one of the things that I think has probably been the most frustrating has been that companies have reduced down the reliance on insights in order to be able to develop mixes. And they've done this in 2 ways. Either they've simply reduced the investment in consumer understanding, or they have taken a decision to try and bring consumer insights in-house. And I think both of these have led to a sort of a dumbing down of the amount of reliable insights that organizations have upon which to build their brands. And we see this often, to be honest. We see where companies are not getting the best quality of insights that they should have, or they're getting no insights and they're making decisions based on intuition, on gut feel, on what they may have done in the past. And I think companies are starting to realize this now, that they need to reinvest in proper professional third-party insights if they're going to return to growth.
So, how can we, speaking of that path back to growth, what are some ways of reaffirming our use of insights as marketers?
So I think this kind of this permeates up through the leadership and the board of the companies involved, and I think they've got to understand the need to invest in insights. And I kind of split insights into two areas. There's the kind of strategic insights that you get, which sort of lay out how brands are positioned, how consumers behave, and so on and so forth. And there are the kind of the tactical insights that you would get when you test mixes or you test elements of mixes. And I think investment in both of these are required going forward. We sort of say to people, look, it's really important that you use reputable organizations to do your research. And it's really important that you try and use the same organization over a period of time to be able to reduce bias and changes in techniques and so on and so forth. But, at every stage of the development process, the people responsible for marketing, the chief marketing officer, the president, the chairman, the managing director, at each stage in the development process, people need to be saying, are the decisions that we are taking grounded in consumer insights? What would our consumers think of this mix? What would they think of the packaging? What would they think of the formulation? What would they think of the advertising? Not what I would think of it or what we would think of it as a leadership team, but what would our consumers think of this? Could be our consumers, our shoppers, our customers. What would they think of the quality of the mix that we are about to amend or about to launch in the marketplace? What do they think of this? Where is the evidence that they think that this is going to be better than what they have had in the past?
So, in talking about mix, it occurs to me as we look through the consumer lens, I feel like we as marketers talk a lot about mix. What is the consumer side of perception related to a brand's mix?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, consumers look at our offering in totality. They don't sit there and slice and dice it like we do. They don't pull apart the packaging. They don't look at the advertising in isolation. They look at the totality of the brand. And there's a couple of things that I think are really important for marketeers on that basis. So the first is that we have to have a really tight proposition for the brand. It's got to be really well defined internally across the organization. What does our brand stand for? What is it that is making our brand unique but relevant to the consumer? And we have to be able to articulate that internally amongst our colleagues, amongst our advertising agencies, our customers, our suppliers, and so on and so forth. And then I think that the second equally important part is that once we have got a really tight articulation of what our brand should mean to the consumer, we then have to go through and we have to assess each of the elements of that brand against that brand proposition to make sure that those elements are exploiting the proposition in the way that it was intended. So is the packaging true to the position of the brand? Is the advertising bringing the brand position to life in a clear and compelling way? Is the formulation bringing the brand to life? Is the formulation doing justice to the promise of the advertising? Does the pricing reflect this? If we're charging a premium price, are we giving the consumer a premium offering? Are all of the elements of the mix, premium? So I think that's kind of the second job, not only of the marketing but also of the board, is to be able to assess the execution of the brand against that brand proposition.
I'm pausing slightly as I make my own notes on the kind of master class of questions that you just gave brands to consider. What a great list of questions. I was just saying to someone the other day that not all questions are created equally. It's about asking the right questions. And the questions that you just outlined there are ones that we need to think a lot about, because bridging that gap between what we're looking at internally, like you said, no one else is slicing and dicing it like we are. We have our own biases there. But then on the other side of that, from the consumer's perspective, and making sure that there's not any daylight between what you're saying and what you're doing at the various levels of your brand experience, of your mix.
Yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself, Nick. I think that's absolutely right. Marketing teams, marketing organizations simply cannot allow the brand to be confused. They cannot send out mixed messages about what the brand is standing for. And whether that's in the advertising or whether that's in a launch of a new variant or a new platform or a new piece of advertising copy, there has to be this consistency that runs across it so that the proposition is true to the essence of the brand. And again, that's kind of the day job of marketing, to make sure that there is no ambiguity in the mind of the consumer as to what the brand is all about. What is that proposition? What is that promise all about?
That is another good point about there not being any ambiguity between all of that as well. I think, again, you're really delivering on arming us with the right questions. And as we look at your work, you work on founder-led brands. And I think sometimes when we talk about founder-led brands, we have really two brands that are in play here. We have the organizational brand, the company brand, the product brand, the service brand, and then we have the personal brand of the founder itself. And sometimes those are symbiotic and complementary, and other times they sort of trip over one another. So what does that dance look like when it comes to founder-led brands?
So that's a fantastic question to be asking, and it's one that we ask all the time when we get asked to work on brands, whether they are for small companies with the founder involved, or whether they're for large multinational companies, because almost all brands started off in one way or another as a founder-led brand, whether the founder owned the business or whether the founder was a brand manager inside a large business. Someone had a vision for what the brand meant, and what we try and do when we are asked to go and help organizations with their brand positioning, to be able to articulate their brand positioning, one of the things that we do is we go back to the origins of the brand, and we dive in to try to understand what it is that made the brand successful when it was first launched. What was that vision that the founder had? What is it that got the initial traction of the brand in the first place? And has that vision been upheld? Is it still being lived today? And if it's not, or if we've sort of wandered away from what the original idea was that the founder had, why did we do that? And were we right in moving away from it, or should we be moving back to what their vision stands for? Now, this could happen over 1 or 2 or 5 years, or it could happen to brands that are 100 years old or 120 years old. And so all the time we're sort of going back and saying, well, look, let's start at the beginning. What makes this brand successful, or what made this brand successful? And is that still relevant today? And most of the time, it probably is still relevant. Of course, the executional elements may need updating and addressing and refining and so on and so forth. But oftentimes that original proposition that the founder had a vision for, that they nurtured, they invested in, and which was very, very successful in the early days, oftentimes that's still as relevant today as when it was first launched 5, 10, 50, 100 years ago.
On Brand, we'll be right back after this.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Danielle Wiley hosts a great podcast called The Art of Sway. Danielle, tell us what you talk about on the show.
The Art of Sway brings listeners inside the world of marketing as seen through the lens of influence. So each week I chat with an expert guest for a lively discussion about connecting ideas with audiences in an attempt to uncover all the ways influence impacts how and what we discover, purchase, and recommend to each other.
Wow. And where can people subscribe?
Go to theartofswaypodcast.com, find the show at marketingpodcasts.net, or search for The Art of Sway wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe. You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Hennika Watkins-Porter hosts The Entrepreneurial You, empowering entrepreneurs with insights on leadership, business, and success. Hennika, tell listeners what to expect from your show.
So we provide innovative business strategies and practical solutions to common entrepreneurial challenges.
And where can people subscribe?
Find us at hennikawatkinsporter.com, as well as the Marketing Podcast Network at marketingpodcasts.net, or search for it wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe.
Now, back to the show. So, you talked about often that being relevant still today. What if it's not?
So that's a good question. And I think that there are a couple of options. If a brand is losing relevance, then very clearly the marketing organization has got a couple of decisions. The first is, can it restore the relevance of the brand today whilst maintaining, whilst being true to what the brand originally stood for? If the brand can be made relevant by, adjusting and modifying the formulation or the packaging or the communication, without alienating the core users, then of course the organization should explore that. Of course, it could well be that the brand simply is no longer relevant to consumers, and no matter how much you try, the declining consumer base, the death of the brand is inevitable. Now, there aren't many examples of this, but there are examples of it. And then I think what you have to do is then, as a marketeer, decide how you're going to move out of that brand and move and come along with a replacement or a new proposition to appeal to consumers. Now, our experience is that in most instances, when we see brands that are struggling, particularly because they are losing relevance, most of the time the situation is recoverable. And by understanding what the core consumers want and by understanding what the non-users are after, oftentimes you can forge a way forward. Now, it's not binary, it's not black and white. You have to be very careful on this, because sometimes trying to attract new users, you will alienate your existing users, or by trying to maintain your existing users, you will never attract new users. So you have to do your homework with your consumers, with the separate groups of consumers, to make sure that you're being successful. Oftentimes we're asked to look at advertising and comment on advertising, and sort of say, well, look, why isn't it working? And one of the questions we're saying, well, who are you testing it amongst? Are you testing it amongst your loyal followers, or are you testing it amongst your non-users? And what results are you expecting to see with those different groups? Are you trying to drive trial, or are you simply trying to retain your core users? And those are the kinds of questions that marketing organizations and their insight teams need to be asking themselves and their research agencies before they start, making changes to the mix.
So you again had a great insight in there, and none of these are, I say this all the time, easy things to check off of a list.
Yeah.
And you talked about that. I keep using the phrase, the dance between gaining new customers without alienating, but at the same time, there's some of your customers that you might need to move away from. Is there an insight, uppercase I or lowercase I, that we can use to navigate what's ultimately kind of a tricky fork in the road for many brands?
It is, and I think a lot of this will come back to what the strategy for the brand is going to be. You know, where does the organization want to drive its growth from? Are they going to simply maintain the brand, expect low to no levels of growth, and be satisfied with a brand that is there simply to provide cash to the organization to invest in other brands? Or are they looking to drive growth from the brand? Now, if it's the former, to some extent that's easy, although the company will have to manage the kind of the fundamental long-term decay of the brand so that it continues to provide cash. On the other hand, if it's looking to grow the brand, then the question is, are we going to grow the brand by trying to get our existing users to buy more? Or are we going to try and grow the brand by getting new users without alienating the existing users? Now, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. It could well be that you can maintain your user base and your existing users, but you can add additional users by simply going out and advertising in maybe different geographical areas, different demographics, and making distribution, improving distribution, and so on and so forth. But it all kind of comes back to the expectation of growth, how you're going to grow the brand, and then what are the levers that you're going to pull to be able to drive that growth. And of course, there are things that you can use. You can use advertising. You can use one of our favorites is innovation. We think is completely under-leveraged in organizations as a way of attracting new users to existing brands, and an area that we try and get our clients to focus on. So there are many tools at the disposal of the marketing organization to be able to employ, to be able to make sure that you can retain your existing base and you can grow the base by attracting new users.
So, as we look forward to the ongoing work of brand management, what's one thing that most brands are missing that could really move the needle?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I want to go back to your very first question. That I think our view is that most brands, many brands, not all, but many brands and indeed organizations are missing the degree of consumer understanding they have to be able to make the decisions they need to make. We encourage companies not to go overboard with their investment in insights. We encourage them to be very careful about where they invest. We find often that companies they've already got the insights, they're just not using it. Or they've got the insights, but they're not sure whether the insights are robust or reliable. And they've done the work, or their predecessor may have done the work, and they look at this and they think, should I trust these results or should I not trust these results? And so, one of the things that we try and do is to help them to sort of say, look, let's look at the research that you've done. Let's look at who the research was done amongst, how old it was, what was the stimulus, what was the agency that did it, what were the questions asked, and we'll give you a view as to whether we think this research is good or not good. If it's good, then you should use it, and we'll show you how you can exploit the insights and so on and so forth going forward. If it's not good, then we need to find a cost-effective way to be able to fill in the gaps. And of course, all organizations are constrained in terms of the resource they've got to invest in insights. What we want to do is to sort of say, look, these are the ones that you really need to focus on in the near term to get that sort of fundamental level of understanding upon which you can start to develop your growth plans and so on and so forth going forward.
So we have been given several great questions to consider and insights to help us with the road ahead. Now it brings a smile to my face to ask you, Richard, for a brand that has made you smile recently.
So that's a great question, Nick. And I wanted to pick a brand that I haven't worked on directly because I thought that would give me an unfair advantage. But one of the brands that I have always loved as a consumer, as a user, and as a father of users is the Kinder brand. It's a brand I'm sure you're familiar with in the US. The brand it's more than 50 years old, and it's a brand that I just love. I mean, of course, chocolate confectionery brings a smile to most people's faces, but I think as a marketeer, it brings a smile to my face because I think it's a particularly well managed brand. And we talked earlier about insights, we talked about consistency, we talked about the need to have a coherent brand to put in front of the consumer. We talked about a brand that is true to the ideals of the founder, of Michel Ferrero when he developed this. I think this is a brand that embodies all of those elements and more. And it's one that I'm full of admiration for the way in which this has been managed over time, across categories and across geographies.
I love it. Great example, great smile, and great reminder as well. Richard, where can folks go to learn more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I work at a company called Alchemy-Rx.com. If people go to our website, it's probably the best way to see what it is that we do. So that's Alchemy, Alchemy-Rx.com. And they can see that. We also lay out tools and techniques in there that people may also find helpful.
Awesome. Well, we will link up to all of that in our show notes, which folks can always find at onbrandpodcast.com. Richard Davies, thanks for being on brand with us.
Thanks, Nick.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Danielle Wiley hosts a great podcast called The Art of Sway. Danielle, tell us what you talk about on the show.
The Art of Sway brings listeners inside the world of marketing as seen through the lens of influence. So each week I chat with an expert guest for a lively discussion about connecting ideas with audiences in an attempt to uncover all the ways influence impacts how and what we discover, purchase, and recommend to each other.
Wow. And where can people subscribe?
Go to theartofswaypodcast.com, find the show at marketingpodcasts.net, or search for The Art of Sway wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe. This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.